The Jungle Tide by John Still.
A mountain valley. In the hollow of the valley, I can hear the mountain river tumble headlong through the boulders, singing on from stone to stone. And yellow-throated orioles the ringing forest fill with melody, while high above I listen all alone. I can single out the voices of the minivets as well, and blossom-headed parrots through the amber air have flown. I can hear the hillside echo to the barbet's golden bell, while high upon the mountainside I ponder all alone. The silver money chinkings of the lovebirds never hush. The robin's pretty flageolet from time to time is blown, and confidential chatter among bulbuls in the bush goes on, but I am silent on the mountainside alone. Chapter 2. A Holy Mountain. In the middle of the hills of Ceylon, now sacred to tea, there towers a mountain so famous that the literature of 2,000 years in several languages would have to be searched if all references to it were to be assembled in one book. Hindus and Buddhists, Mohammedans and Eastern Christians alike revere the mountain as a holy place. And there is some evidence that the jungle people who came before all these did likewise. It is certain that the peak was holy 15 centuries ago, when the oldest Sinhalese literature that has survived was composed out of fragments and books already old and being forgotten. And it is almost as certain that it was holy 1,000 years before that, when legends of Buddha attached to it, and when it became the refuge of some of the aboriginal inhabitants of Lanka who fled before the advance of the first Sinhalese invaders. Whether it was holy even earlier than that, in the days when the men of those mountains used chert and crystal flakes for their tools and weapons, there is nothing directly to say. But deposits of their artifacts lie upon so many of the lesser hills around the peak that this too seems not unreasonable to suppose. Holy in the past, at the present day it is so sacred that rich men accustomed to wear European clothes and socks and boots will toil barefooted up its rough and stony way to the shrine of the footprint upon the summit, more than 7,300 feet above the level of the ocean, that can be seen as a glittering cord stretched along the horizon 50 miles away. To be high priest of the peak is one of the highest titles in the Buddhist hierarchy, but a more real holiness is shown by the fact that the girls of those castes whose women have from time immemorial made beauty their profession and its traffic their trade, will yield to no temptation while on pilgrimage to the peak, not even while their feet have still many miles to go before attaining the foothills of the range from which the holy mountain springs. I have climbed it many a time when pilgrims by the thousands wound up its rugged path by torchlight, singing as they went. I have camped with them in its sheltering caves, and with them I have kept vigil the long night through on the cold wind-swept summit, waiting for the rising sun to announce that the time has come to pray. For there is an element of sun worship in all these religions that comes to the surface then, and the shouts of the multitude ring out like the cries of Hosanna in the Bible. Among the pilgrims I have seen people of half a dozen races, with as many languages, and at least 4 distinct religions beside many sects, and I can testify to their reverence. For the East understands religion, whereas we of the West have made of it a form of warfare. There was no policeman there, and no one in authority at all, so far as I could learn, but the place was holy ground, and the tolerance of the pilgrims seemed a thing that might well have been studied by Western ecclesiastics with honor and amazement, perhaps even in shame. I mentioned this tolerance once to a bishop and was told it was a sign of weakness of faith. Persecution, I suppose, is a sign of strength. Let this brief survey of the mountain's holiness from the dimmest past up to the present suffice, without attempting to define what holiness may be, and whether subjective or otherwise. But of a use for this holiness in the future, I have a word to say later. Where a force exists, it should be turned to good use. Near the foot of Adams Peak, engineers are busy now, 1928, tapping the vast energies to be won from storing in a mountain valley the rain that falls so heavily in the wilderness of the peak. They talk in terms of hundreds of thousands of horsepower, and comparisons have even been made with the forces harnessed at Niagara. But I am thinking in terms of millions of manpower of reverence stored up through the ages, and will presently suggest a use it may be put to. About a quarter of a century ago, after 3 pilgrimages to the peak had whetted my appetite for its secrets, I set forth to spend some weeks in exploring its recesses more thoroughly. One of my aims was to identify the various places described by Ibn Battuta, the Arab traveller who rivaled Marco Polo when he climbed the mountain in the middle of the 14th century of our era. But that aim I speedily abandoned. Some of the spots he mentioned were too easy to find, and some too impossible. And it was so utterly unimportant to identify any of them that I turned to more congenial quests, and spent my time in hunting for old inscribed rocks, and for the mysterious cavern in the lost valley where elephants go to die. This I failed to find, and since have wondered if the legend be one of those which seem to attach to particular geological formations and are carried about the world by itinerant storytellers until they grow naturalized in every clime, or perchance spring anew in human minds as freshly remembered things that lie so deep within us that they are common experience to the ancestors of all peoples. Such is the story of the secret passage from the castle on the crag, a tale which runs the length of Europe and through Turkey into Middle Asia to my knowledge. And another is the tale of the gigantic snake or dragon who lives in an undiscoverable cave beneath temples built on rocks. In the Nilgiris, too, there is a legend of a valley of death that none return from, and perhaps the story told by Hudson of the Vale of Death of the Guanacos may be the South American version. I found no gleaming pile of bones and ivory, though once the music played loud when I came upon a stone with the figure of an elephant carved upon it beside an incised picture of a pointing hand with 6 fingers. But my search at least led me into many of the more hidden secrets of the wilderness of the peak. I climbed cliffs and crept along high ledges where subalpine flowers rewarded me. I discovered caves long lost in forest, but once the habitations of hermits. And from one group of these I followed an ancient way, long since abandoned and overgrown by the all-conquering trees, where flights of steps cut in the rock led upward towards the sacred footprint. Inscriptions, too, I found, though none so old as I had hoped. Some were cut in stone, where the surfaces of rocks were flat, and others were engraved upon links of the mighty chains that hung from the precipices, and once were the only way to climb them. But none of all of them dated earlier than the kings of the Polonnaruan dynasties of about the 12th century AD. I was told a tale of those chains. They hang over cliffs, exposed to the full fury of the monsoon gales. Their links are formed like stirrups, and the pilgrims used until steps were cut less than half a century ago to climb them as a kind of swaying rope ladder. A whole family of Sinhalese villagers once set out on pilgrimage, children and their parents, and the grandparents too. And when they came to the precipices and were all hanging on the long chain like a living rosary, a violent storm sprang up suddenly, and the chain was swung fiercely from side to side. But they still hung on, though they dared not move in either direction, up or down. Then came a tremendous gust, like the breath of an angry god, and the chain was swung so far to one side that it hung no longer over the pilgrim path, but clear above a frightful fall into a valley far below. And there, buffeted by the storm, unable to climb or to descend, the people hung while their strength endured, and then fell off one by one as fruits fall from a tree. First the old and the very young, then the women, and last of all the men, while the folk of their village, who had been waiting for their own turn to climb upon the chain, and who had watched the whole tragedy while they cowered against the face of the angry mountain, saw in the end the strongest man of all, last of his race, leave hold and go spinning down to the treetops far below. One inscription I found held some interest, for it served to confirm, so far as it went, the accuracy of the old monk who wrote that part of the Mahavamsa, the Sinhalese people's remarkable history kept up at intervals for more than 13 centuries, which gives a baffling and incomplete account of King Nisankamalla in the 12th century AD. The historian says that Nisanka climbed the holy mountain, and this feat is recorded of only 2 or 3 out of some 150 kings who find mention. In a cave near the summit, I found a little picture chiseled upon the rock wall, with a few words cut beside it in 12th century script. It showed a man in an attitude of adoration with a rosary held in his joined hands, and the words read, King Nisankamalla worships the footprint on the rock. Throughout these explorations, my guide was an elderly Sinhalese man who had hunted for honey in those jungles. His name was Kirilamaya, or in English, Milk Baby. He was unconscious that his grey beard made a joke of this, and I trust he did not become enlightened, for he was a real friend and a most charming companion. After all, the name Suckling finds a place in English history. Kirilamaya had all the local legends and superstitions at his finger ends, and though his knowledge of the range did not extend far from the pilgrim path, his woodcraft sufficed to regain camp, however far we had wandered into the remoter parts of the wilderness. We climbed along ledges and hunted for caves, and some of the many we found had been inhabited by man, though more were the homes of nothing but bats or porcupines. Some caves we found could only be reached by the notches their former users had cut in the trunks of ancient rhododendrons, which grew against the cliff, and in several of these there were inscriptions in Chinese characters cut into the rock and gilded. In this crumpled land of constant rain, there is no end to the number of streams, and we explored many of them right up to their sources. But we failed to find the secret garden legend tells of, those strange exotic trees, drop blossoms that may be found floating in the cold torrent that bathes the feet of the cliffs of Ganguli Hela, an echo perhaps of the story of the Garden of Eden. In some of the rocks of the stream beds, captive boulders had ground deep potholes, and we found garnets in the sand that gathered there. But Kirilamaya told stories of the discovery of more valuable stones, a not unlikely thing, for the gem-bearing gravels of Ratnapura, city of jewels, whose sapphires and rubies, cat's eyes and tourmalines have been famed for at least 1,000 years, lie in valleys among the foothills of this range. In one streambed, we found people who had been turned into stone as by Medusa. for some sin I have now forgotten. For this is a region where the miraculous is held to be as probable as the ordinary, and where the legends of all religions are interwoven. For the footprint on the rock, that which men go out into the wilderness to see, is sacred to them all. It is only a shallow depression in the rock, some 2 yards long, but to Buddhists it is the footprint of their founder, and they call the mountain simply Sri Pada, a sacred footprint. Hindus name it Sivas. Mohammedans of both sects call the mountain Father Adam's Hill, and though the modern name follows this in calling it Adam's Peak, Eastern Christians believe the mark to have been imprinted by the foot of St. Thomas, who is peculiarly the apostle of India. But the place is almost overburdened with such names, and another common one, Samanalakanda, the hill of the god Saman, has given to butterflies their euphonious Sinhalese title Samanalaya. For at certain times of the year, when countless millions of butterflies stream out on migration, they are supposed to be going on pilgrimage to end their short lives on the sacred mountain. The peak must be one of the vastest and most widely reverenced cathedrals of the human race. But the shrine itself is only a little tile roof raised upon 4 pillars, or maybe 8, open on all 4 sides to every wind that blows, and untended by any human being for months at a time when the rains are at their heaviest. And the only other building there in my time was a small mud hut of 1 room which I was lent by the monk in charge. Right to the very summit of the peak the forest grows, and from the parapet wall itself one may pick blossoms from the tops of old wild rhododendrons and read in their mottled throats the name of God written in letters that all may read who will. Looking down from this wall, one can see how for miles and miles on every side each fold of the hills and every valley is clothed in an ancient forest that has never known the axe and is justly named the wilderness of the peak. The profusion of its beauty alone would inspire any sensitive being with a feeling of awe, and it may have been this unparalleled loveliness that led some man, who knows how many thousands of years ago, to name it holy. I climbed up once when no pilgrims had travelled the road for several months of very wet weather, and had to crush my way through masses of begonias and balsams, and to tread upon pink orchids as I climbed, while the roofs of the shelters below the cliffs were clouded over with a mist of yellow calceolaria. In the stillness of the evening, when no pilgrims are there, voices come up from this old forest, out from the depths of the valleys thousands of feet below, and from the slopes and from the ridges of lesser hills that reach up in reverence like disciples beside their master. Always there is the song of the streams which run hidden in their tunnels of trees festooned with orchids, Dendrobium aureum or Nakati, and often one may hear the cries of animals, the strident roar of leopards, the horn-like challenge of sambar stags, the scream of eagles, the deep tones of the great black monkeys of the hills, and more tremendous than any, the trumpeting of elephants. But the forest is full of life, though in its extreme density it is rare to see any living animal other than the squirrels and monkeys who move among the treetops. But their tracks and their voices betray the greater animals, and it was almost entirely due to their presence that we were able to explore at all. This forest is a very wet one, and consequently very dense, and much of it is bound into an unbelievably impenetrable tangle by creeping bamboo, whose long tendrils, hard and thin as telegraph wire, form a mesh difficult for man to enter unless he can cut his way painfully, yard by yard. To the elephants, with their giant strength and weight, it is a different matter. They live for the most part on wood pulp ground by their four huge teeth from the branches of trees, and this leads them to explore just as my different quests led me. All the time I was in the wilderness, I found only one open space, high upon a col between two peaks, a fairy land of grass and flowers. But I had no difficulty in marching in any direction I desired, for the elephant roads ran everywhere. Man's roads pursue valleys for the most part, but the high roads made by elephants slant up the flanks of hills to gain the ridges as early as they may, and then travel along high ground as far as they possibly can. They are firm and of easy gradient to walk, though walled as they are by the yielding but unbreakable netting of the bamboo. They may be perilous to use unless precautions be taken not to come unawares upon their makers, for to avoid a charge or even a startled stampede would be difficult, as although the bulk of an elephant is vast compared to that of a man, his road generally suffices only for men to proceed in single file. We went with caution, as though on the heels of great game. Kirilamia took a further precaution, and I followed him to set his mind at peace, for he avoided all reference to elephants by name, lest they should hear and resent it. The great ones, he called them, or the old ones, or simply they. We were pursuing an elephant road one day through the very thickest undergrowth of all. What tracks there were led in the direction opposite to ours, so we felt sure we were not on an elephant's heels, though, of course, we might meet one. But all suddenly the road ended on a little flat place, and we found ourselves in an oval room walled around by unbroken bamboo. The floor was trodden perfectly flat and even, and the room was about the size of an ordinary drawing room. Kirilamia ventured the only explanation that seemed probable. He thought it might be a bridal chamber, the secret place of some gigantic love. One is tempted to think that wherever a man may climb, so may an elephant, for their immense footprints, smaller only than that on the mountain's top, are to be found upon the highest ridges and on the summits of peaks hard to scale. It is only the encircling wall that holds them from measuring their feet with Buddhas, and I have little doubt that elephants stood there before ever men did, for chains are not needed upon the muscular side. Not only the elephants who made them, but all other animals of any size use the elephant roads, save only the monkeys, who have roads of their own through the trees and over the rocks. Without roads, animals could not go in comfort at speed. Where the roads cross valleys, they indicate the fords. Where ridges, they reveal the passes. Probably they are of enormous antiquity, for such features as fords and passes change only with the waning of geological periods. Also, the standardization of all such roads in their general system of avoiding valleys and pursuing ridges, and the similarity of their gradients seem to reveal a very ancient craft, now fixed in principles as scientific as elephants are likely to attain before man imprisons or slays the last of them. Doubtless, man learned road making from the elephants or from other great beasts when first he took the floor. For before the age of metals, he could ill spare his precious stone tools to such blunting work as felling trees he did not wish to use. The flinty bamboos would soon dull the edge of a crystal knife, and I have little doubt that man in Stone Age blessed the elephants even as Kirilamia and I did. Did he too call them Fey, as he hunted sambar on the hills where I hunted inscriptions? It has often been noticed by those who have hunted big game in forest lands how, after a few crashes, a startled animal's movements fall suddenly silent, and many a hunter has peered into the bushes expecting to find his quarry dead there, when in reality it is speeding along a game track half a mile away. I think animals always travel along roads for choice. They spread far and wide to seek for food and comb out every inch of the forest. But when traveling on a journey, and especially when desirous of moving at once silently and with speed, they use roads just as we do. One reads sometimes of impenetrable bush where exploration is hampered or even for many years actually prevented by the impossibility of getting through fast enough to escape death by starvation or thirst. And it has struck me that the accounts I have read of this have all been written of countries east of Polus's line, where mammals are replaced by marsupials. New Guinea and the western parts of Tasmania are the cases I have in mind. It seems ludicrous that a country so small as Tasmania, inhabited by one of the most adventurous races in the world, should remain partially unexplored, and I cannot but wonder if it may be due to the lack of road making animals. Marsupials are of earlier type than mammals and may not yet have invented roads, for I feel sure that if a few wild elephants were loosed in one of the mountain ranges of New Guinea, they would road the whole of their neighborhood rapidly and thoroughly. Then, instead of cutting their way painfully yard by yard, explorers would be able to walk at normal speed. All fords and passes would be revealed to them, and in arid lands, what waterholes there were would be centers from which roads would radiate as from Piccadilly Circus. No harm would be done to anyone, and to learn the rate at which even so slow a breeder as the elephant can multiply, one has only to look up the calculation made by Darwin in The Origin of Species. Long years after the rest of the world had forgotten what elephants look like, the mountains of New Guinea might be a sanctuary for herds. One mistake only would have to be avoided. It would not do to put in a tusked variety, or contraband trade in ivory would soon end the experiment. Ceylon elephants very rarely have tusks and are easily tamed. There was one place that Kirilamia feared more than he feared the great ones, and that was a sort of open cavern on the summit of one of the highest peaks. Nothing would induce him to enter it, for, he said, who enters there leaves sanity behind. Apparently, there was some god who smote with madness those who invaded his privacy. One of the territorial wood gods, I fancy, though as a rule they are not malignant. Except for the god's invisible presence, there was nothing there at all, and no sign of former human habitation. I entered, and, strange to say, I am one of the very few people I know who has been declared insane. It will be well to explain immediately that this was done by a Turkish medical board while I was a prisoner of war engaged in secret code correspondence with my own country. So perhaps that God had nothing to do with it, though surely my evidence would justify the building of a temple in his honor. In one deep valley below the peak, we came where leeches were as thick as the leaves that littered the floor, thicker than the hairs on an elephant's back. Every writer on Ceylon has told stories of these. Ibn Battuta mentions how in this very neighborhood he was attacked by the fierce leech, and I think it was Riberia who told how they entered between the joints of the Portuguese officer's armor, though I should have thought armor alone would suffice to kill its wearer in the tropics. They were thick enough in that valley to be almost frightening. I relied upon boots and puttees, but Kirilamia, marching almost naked, carried the half of a lime fruit impaled upon a little stick, and with that light hammer tapped each leech that attacked him and left it squirming with its skin dried up by the astringent juice. And as we walked, he told me the story of a man who came into trouble through leeches. He was a Vedarala, a village doctor of the Ayurvedic school of medicine, who went in search of Waduro monkeys whose fat he desired to render into a medicinal oil for the cure of swollen heads. In his benighted folly, he pursued his chase on the lower slopes of the holy mountain, where he stalked his quarry and shot him. The monkey clung to the branch, and when he fell, hung in a high fork of the tree and died there. The Vedarala wanted his fat very badly indeed and began to climb the tree, but its branches were slippery with sodden moss, and his handhold failed, and he fell to the earth and lay there unable to rise, for his back was injured. Then the leeches came, looping along by ones, by tens, by hundreds, and at last in such myriads that his whole body was covered by their waving multitude, and all the blood was sucked out of his veins. The men who at last found him had to light torches with which to sweep the foul tribe of blood-congested creatures from his corpse before they could carry it away for burial. This was told to me as a true story, and I believe it, for imagination could scarce exaggerate the prodigious armies of leeches to be found in some of the deep, wet valleys. It was in a wet valley that I saw one night a very beautiful sight of the kind that gives rise to superstitious fear. It was too high above sea level for there to be any termites, being actually a part of Adam's Peak itself. So the fallen twigs and branches lay where they fell until agents, slower than white ants, ultimately consumed them. The night that I slept there was very dark, and it poured with rain, and the whole floor of the forest was lit by the phosphorescence of some fungus that had invaded the dead branches. Each was a silvery green bar of shimmering light, and our faces shone as the faces of the dead. In some of the valleys around the peak, there are caverns among the boulders fallen from the cliffs above. I suppose that every one of them is the home of a family of porcupines, and several I entered had attached to the undersides of their sloping roofs small or large colonies of the esculent swift, the bird who builds from his own sputum the edible swallow's nests, beloved of the Chinese. I examined many and found their substance like gelatine or pale-colored glue, but did not eat any. Much has been written of the shadow of the peak, which, as the sun rises, seems to be projected upon the eye instead of lying upon the forest below, as one's eyes expect. The shadow has even been photographed and reproduced in books. It is certainly a curious optical phenomenon, but it has lent itself to exaggerated description so often that I hesitate to speak of it. However, I once saw it from a point of view that has never been described and which so impressed me that I called a friend out of bed to bear witness. I saw it from the Grand Oriental Hotel in Colombo, some 50 miles from the peak, from a window over the porch of the old building. The morning was clear, and as it grew light, I looked unto the hills whence cometh the help of the dweller in the tropics, and saw the battlements of the central range change from dead black to the amethystine translucency that heralds the birth of day. Then, with measurable movement, a beam of darkness crept from the top of Adam's Peak and stole up into the brightly colored sky. It resembled the negative of a searchlight's beam, and in appearance was so odd and unexpected that I called to my witness that the peak was smoking like a volcano. Then, as we watched, I realized that it was the famous shadow of the peak, seen from below. And a moment later, the sun rose directly behind the cone of the mountain until its gold was notched in the rim at 6 o'clock, as we were taught to hold the foresight of a rifle on a bullseye. Below Adams Peak, on the civilized side, in the district of Muskelia among the tea plantations, engineers are at work on the great hydroelectric scheme that is to turn this valley into a lake 4,000 feet above sea level, and thus create so enormous a quantity of power that if ever their estimates are realized and the water power actually absorbed by the industrial undertakings, the wealth of Ceylon will be vastly increased. This will bring some good, perhaps, as well as some evil. But one thing it appears to threaten is important, and that is the character of the holy mountain. It is difficult to yoke very, very ancient things with the newest improvements and preserve their old values. Yet the power is there, and the wealth it promises draws men irresistibly to use it before it runs down to the sea. I would like to make a suggestion. The holiness is there too. Why not use that as well? I would like to see the whole wilderness of the peak that still remains crown property gazetted as a national park and game sanctuary, where none may hunt or shoot or trap or fish, where trees may not be felled, nor any orchids or other plants uprooted, nor any be purposely introduced. Within the protected area, I would include the lake that within a few years will come to be in the valley of Muskelia, for it will certainly grow to hold great numbers of fish and will become the home of many waterfowl. It is already the policy of the government to retain all forest above 5,000 feet in elevation as a reserve for the conservation of rainfall, and nothing would be lost by carrying out the further proposal. Indeed, much would be gained, and a measure which may one day be upset if rainfall be found not to depend upon forests would be broadened and assured. Buddhists and Hindus between them number probably more than 9 out of every 10 pilgrims, and both religions enjoin respect for animal life as positive commandments in a way that sets an example to all other creeds. Ceylon has gained sanctuaries in the low country, remote places where only an occasional official, a rare keeper, or a less rare poacher can enjoy what they preserve. But in the mountains there is no sanctuary. Though nearly all the flora there, some of the mammals, many of the birds, and most of the butterflies are different from their counterparts in the plains. And here the pilgrim path would enable all comers to enjoy what would belong to all. Coffee and tea have destroyed so much of the wonderful forest life of the mountain zone that it is more than time something was done to preserve and safeguard forever all that remains unspoiled. The measure would be supported by public opinion so wholeheartedly that the work of wardens would be made easy, and a great thing with rich governments would cost little or nothing. As the lake fills, it may become a part of one of the most beautiful places upon earth, and not only that, but a treasure garden full of interest to the botanist, the naturalist, the specialist in rare forms of the teeming tropical life that in its entirety makes the kingdom of the jungle, from the great trees and the elephants to the smallest lichens and fungi and the microscopic things that live on them. The sanctuary might well become in time the last refuge of the Ceylon elephant, a distinct variety from the Indian. To the anthropologist and the student of religions, it would be a place where he would seek for legends and folklore and the wisdom of ancient times. And it would marry together the ideals of modern England and ancient Lanka in a way few other measures could. For here, where the holy mountain will be mirrored in the water of the hydroelectric reservoir, wisdom can come full circle. And once more it can be remembered that a Sinhalese King Buddhadasa organized a national veterinary service 15 centuries ago and built hospitals for animals. Nor was he so much of an innovator as one might think. For one of his predecessors of centuries before proclaimed that the fish and all living things in the Baya Weber Lake in his capital Anuradhapura should be free from fear of men, thus perhaps being the first of men to form what we now call a game sanctuary. If the step I venture to advocate be taken, it should be done at once, for otherwise vested interests in the fishing of the lake are certain to be formed.